Parents gave my brother $100,000 for a house and gave me nothing but, "You're the failure." So I stopped calling them. 2 years later, my brother drove past my property and called Dad screaming, "You need." Before I get into everything, let me ask you something. Where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. I'm always curious to see how far these stories reach. Now let's get into it. My name's Lena. I'm 28, and for as long as I can remember, I was the forgotten child in my family. My parents, Richard and Elaine, never even tried to hide their favoritism. My younger brother Dylan, 2 years behind me, was always the golden boy. If he got a C on a test, it was framed as progress. If I brought home an A, my dad would shrug and say, "Well, of course you should. You'll never measure up to Dylan anyway." Those words stuck with me more than I ever let them know. When I graduated college, debt-free after working 2 jobs, no one even showed up to my ceremony. Dylan, on the other hand, dropped out twice, and instead of lectures, my parents rewarded him with a brand new car to help him get back on track. I kept telling myself it didn't matter, that my independence would be the thing that set me apart. But deep down, the sting of being second best in my own family was impossible to ignore. The breaking point came 2 years ago. Dylan had just finished college, barely scraping through, and my parents decided to host a dinner. I walked in and saw balloons, champagne, the whole celebration laid out like it was a holiday. Then Richard proudly pulled out a check and handed it to Dylan. $100,000. A full down payment for his first house. Everyone clapped except me. I felt my stomach twist into knots. I asked if they'd ever thought about helping me even a fraction of that way, considering I'd been on my own since 18. My mom actually laughed. She looked me dead in the eye and said, "Lena, you've always been the failure. Dylan deserves it. He has potential." My brother smirked, didn't even thank them, just soaked up the praise. I don't remember much of the rest of the dinner. I just remember walking out, tears burning my face, and vowing never to give them the satisfaction of seeing me break again. That night, I decided I was done being the family punching bag. No more phone calls, no more visits, no more begging to be seen. If they thought I was a failure, fine. I'd prove them wrong, but on my own terms, without their money, without their approval, and without letting them drag me down ever again. When I think back to my childhood, it feels like every memory is split in two. One side full of praise for Dylan and the other side a cold silence directed at me. He could bring home a drawing with stick figures, and my parents would act like he had painted a masterpiece. If I showed them an award, the response was a distracted nod before they turned their attention back to him. It wasn't even subtle. The contrast was so sharp that I grew up knowing exactly where I stood in their eyes. The phrase that cut the deepest came from my father. It wasn't said once or twice. It was a steady drumbeat I couldn't escape. "You'll never measure up to Dylan." I heard it when I got a good grade, when I tried out for sports, when I mentioned dreams I had for the future. No matter how much effort I poured into anything, it was reduced to nothing with that single line. I learned early that I could never win in their game. As I got older, the favoritism didn't fade. It grew bolder. I managed to push myself through college without owing a single cent. Every extra hour waiting tables, every late night studying, was proof to myself that I was capable. Still, not a word of recognition came from them. Dylan, on the other hand, stumbled again and again. He dropped out once, came back half-heartedly, and dropped out again. Each failure was met with excuses and reassurances. Instead of consequences, he was rewarded. They handed him the keys to a shiny new car as if the slate had been wiped clean. I told myself it didn't matter, that I could build a life without their approval. I tried to block out the comparisons, to remind myself that independence was worth more than any pat on the back they refused to give me. Still, resentment seeped in like water through cracks. It wasn't about the money or the attention anymore. It was about being invisible in a family where I should have mattered. Standing in the middle of that imbalance, I promised myself something. If they wouldn't see my worth, I'd carve out a life that made it undeniable. I would never ask them for anything. I would never lean on their help. Whatever I built, it would be with my own hands. Even if it took years, even if it broke me down, I would prove that I didn't need their validation to succeed. The evening was supposed to feel like family, but from the moment I walked in, it felt staged. The table was set with expensive wine, polished cutlery, and the kind of overdone spread my parents only pulled out when they wanted to flaunt something. I didn't know what the occasion was until Richard reached into his jacket and slid a slip of paper across to Dylan. The room erupted in applause as if he'd won some kind of lottery. I stared at the figure written in ink. More money than I had ever seen in my life. 100,000. A down payment on his future handed to him like a prize for simply existing. My chest tightened as Elaine leaned toward me with a cold smile. Her words cut deeper than anything she had ever said before. We want to invest in a child who has potential. You're on your own. The humiliation was suffocating. I sat frozen, the clinking of glasses and forced laughter around me sounding distant. Dylan didn't even muster a thank you. He leaned back in his chair, smug like the whole evening had been orchestrated for him to watch me squirm. His eyes flicked toward mine, a silent reminder of where I stood in the family hierarchy, beneath him always. I tried to swallow it down, but every second made it harder to breathe. My hands trembled under the table, my face hot with anger and shame. That single moment was heavier than years of being overlooked. It wasn't just favoritism, it was a declaration. They didn't believe in me, didn't even care to pretend. I pushed back my chair in the middle of their celebration. Forks paused midair, conversations halted, but I didn't care. I couldn't sit there another second watching them cheer for him while using me as the punchline. Without a word, I walked out, leaving their laughter and the clatter of dishes behind. Out in the night air, I felt tears sting my cheeks, but under that pain was something sharper, resolve. If I was ever going to make something of myself, it would never be tied to them. No more asking, no more hoping they'd change. Whatever future I carved out would be mine alone. I told myself then and there, if I succeed, it'll be without them. And for the first time I felt the smallest spark of freedom. I packed what little I owned and drove until the skyline faded into farmland. The only place I could afford was a weather-beaten farmhouse sitting on a patch of overgrown land. The roof sagged, the porch tilted, and the walls smelled of mildew, but it was mine. Signing those papers with trembling hands felt both terrifying and liberating. I had no safety net, no backup plan. Just 4 broken walls and the determination to survive. Days blurred together as I tried to hold everything afloat. At dawn, I pulled on worn gloves and spent hours pushing mowers, trimming hedges, and hauling heavy bags of soil for clients who barely noticed me. Dirt stayed embedded under my nails, sunburnt skin peeled, and my body ached constantly. When the sun went down, there was no rest. I changed clothes in the truck and headed straight to the bar, serving drinks to rowdy crowds until the last customer stumbled out. Tips barely covered groceries and utility bills, but I kept at it. Every quiet moment was poisoned by echoes from the past. My father's sneer, my mother's dismissal, that ugly word, failure, repeated in my head when exhaustion threatened to crush me. Some nights, I collapsed onto the thin mattress on the farmhouse floor and wondered if they had been right. Maybe I really wasn't enough. Maybe I should have stayed close, played their game, begged for scraps of approval. The lowest point came when my battered truck gave out on a back road. The engine coughed, sputtered, and died, leaving me stranded in the dark with nothing but the sound of cicadas. I sat there gripping the wheel, heart pounding, wondering how I could possibly keep going if even my only means of transportation was gone. For a moment I wanted to let it all swallow me, to stop fighting a battle that never seemed to end. But anger sparked through the despair. I refused to let their voices be the truth of my life. I scraped together what I could, found a local mechanic willing to work out a cheap deal, and pushed forward again. Every hour I worked, every repair I made on that crumbling farmhouse, became proof that I wasn't done. Pride kept me standing when everything else tried to knock me down. And slowly, stubbornly, I chose to keep going, because giving up would mean they were right and I couldn't let that happen. The house that once felt like it might collapse on me began to change little by little. I climbed onto the roof with borrowed tools and patched the holes that had let rain soak the ceilings. My hands blistered, my back ached, but every nailed shingle felt like proof I wasn't beaten. I scraped away peeling paint and rolled new color over the faded walls until the place started to look less abandoned and more like a home. Out back, I tore through weeds and dug into stubborn soil until a small garden finally sprouted green. Watching life push up from dirt I had worked myself gave me a spark of something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. People in the area noticed the effort. An older couple from down the road stopped by one afternoon with a basket of tomatoes and kind words. They didn't look at me like a burden or a disappointment. They admired the sweat on my shirt and told me it reminded them of when they first started out. Their encouragement didn't erase the years of dismissal from my family, but it softened the weight I carried. For once I felt seen. The first true milestone came when I walked into the mechanic's shop with an envelope of cash I had earned myself and handed it over to clear the bill for my truck. No credit cards, no loans, no handouts, just nights behind the bar and days in the dirt. Driving away in that truck, knowing I had paid every cent, filled me with a pride that money from anyone else could never buy. Meanwhile, whispers from relatives carried news of Dylan's supposed success. He flaunted pictures of his spotless house and expensive furniture, spinning the image of a life handed to him like a trophy. They repeated his boasts as though they were gospel, never asking what it cost to maintain that illusion. Hearing it secondhand stung, but not because I envied him. It was because they still believed his version of the story, the golden boy shining bright while I was written off as invisible. I stood in my yard one evening, dirt under my fingernails, paint smudged on my arms, and looked at the farmhouse taking shape around me. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine, and every inch carried my sweat. I whispered to myself a promise that kept me going. One day they would see what I had built and they would choke on the words they used to define me. News started to trickle back to me through cousins and distant relatives. Dylan, the one they had poured everything into, wasn't keeping up with his responsibilities. Whispers about late payments and overdue notices followed his name, though my parents tried their best to keep it quiet. They quietly funneled money his way, slipping him lifelines while pretending everything was fine. I could almost hear the desperation in the way people explained it. Richard and Elaine bending over backwards to shield him from the fallout. Instead of tightening his belt, Dylan threw himself deeper into spending. He rolled up to family gatherings flashing pictures of his latest purchases. A flashy boat, dirt bikes, gadgets that cost more than I could imagine. He acted like these toys proved he was successful, even as the walls of his house began to crack around him. Stories spread about repairs left undone, leaks ignored, paint peeling while he spent weekends showing off. He wanted the image of wealth, not the work that came with it. The irony wasn't lost on me. While he let his place deteriorate, my small patch of land was slowly transforming into something livable. What had once been an eyesore now carried the marks of steady effort. The roof held strong, the garden flourished, the barn stood solid after endless weekends of labor. Neighbors who once looked at the property with pity began to smile when they passed by. My pride wasn't in fancy purchases or hollow displays. It was in every board nailed, every seed sprouted, every corner I had revived with my own two hands. Each time I heard about Dylan's latest disaster, I felt a mix of bitterness and quiet satisfaction. The same parents who once declared I wasn't worth investing in were draining themselves to cover for him, the so-called child with potential. And while they scrambled to keep his illusion intact, I was quietly building a life they never believed I could. Standing on my porch at dusk, watching the sun sink over fields I had reclaimed, I couldn't help but feel the weight of the irony pressing in. They gave him everything and he squandered it. They gave me nothing and I turned it into something real. Every crack in his foundation made mine feel stronger. The story was writing itself and the contrast was impossible to ignore. 2 years slipped by in a blur of sweat and determination, and the land that once looked abandoned barely resembled what I had first bought. The garden stretched wide and green, overflowing with vegetables and flowers that drew butterflies in the summer. Fresh paint covered the farmhouse, its walls no longer cracked and faded but bright against the open fields. A sturdy barn stood nearby, red and strong, built board by board with careful effort. Every inch of the property carried the mark of countless hours I had poured into it, and for the first time in my life, I felt real pride when I walked outside my own front door. One warm afternoon while I was working near the fence line, a car slowed as it drove past. I didn't recognize the vehicle at first, but when it stopped just beyond the gate, I caught sight of Dylan behind the wheel. His expression shifted from confusion to shock as he scanned the land that stretched before him. I froze, watching as his jaw tightened, his eyes darting between the farmhouse, the barn, and the flourishing yard. He didn't wave, didn't say a word. He simply grabbed his phone and started dialing. I didn't need to hear the full conversation to understand. His voice carried across the quiet road, loud and panicked as he shouted into the phone, "You need to see what Lena has. She's living better than me, and you gave me everything." The anger in his tone wasn't just about surprise. It was jealousy, raw and ugly. That moment hit harder than I expected. My parents had always assumed I was barely scraping by, convinced I was struggling just to get through each day. They had written me off completely, never once checking in or offering kindness. And now, through Dylan's outrage, they were finally being confronted with a truth they hadn't prepared for. The daughter they dismissed as a failure had created something with her own hands, something even their golden child couldn't match. I stood there silently as Dylan's car sped off, leaving dust swirling in the air. My heart pounded not from fear or shame, but from the satisfaction of knowing they couldn't ignore me anymore. The sight of my farm alive and thriving had spoken louder than any words I could have ever thrown at them. For the first time, it wasn't me chasing their recognition. It was them being forced to see what I had become. One morning, the sound of tires crunching on gravel pulled me from my work in the garden. When I looked up, a familiar car rolled to a stop at the end of my drive. Richard stepped out first, smoothing his shirt like he was arriving for a pleasant visit, and Elaine followed, clutching a basket of store-bought pastries as if that would soften the intrusion. Their smiles looked practiced, too polished, the kind people put on when they're hiding something. I stayed by the fence, dirt still on my gloves, and waited for them to speak. Elaine was the first, her voice light, almost rehearsed. "We always knew you'd make something of yourself." The words rang hollow, so different from what I had carried with me all those years. I didn't return the smile, and I didn't move to invite them inside. Richard cleared his throat, glancing around the property as if he was taking inventory. He muttered something about how they had to help Dylan because he needed a stronger start, because life had been harder for him. The explanation was thin, a patchwork excuse that only underlined what I already knew. They had chosen him over me again and again, and now they were scrambling to make it sound reasonable. I let their words hang in the air, refusing to ease their discomfort. Finally, I spoke, my voice steady. "You called me a failure, remember? This failure built all this without you." The silence that followed was heavier than anything else they'd said. Elaine's smile faltered and Richard's eyes dropped to the ground. They shifted uncomfortably, trying to find another angle, but I didn't waver. I kept the door behind me closed, my arms crossed, showing them that whatever they wanted from me, apology, forgiveness, recognition, they weren't going to get it. For once, the balance had shifted. They were on the outside, looking in, while I stood firm on the life I had made for myself. When they finally turned back to their car, I didn't stop them. I watched as they drove away, the false cheer slipping from their faces. Their visit hadn't been about pride. It had been about control, about reclaiming some place in a story they had abandoned me in long ago. And now they knew they couldn't rewrite it. I had already written it myself. It didn't take long after their visit for Dylan to show up. He came without warning, swaggering up the driveway like he already owned a piece of it. His eyes scanned the house, the barn, the garden, and then landed on me with something twisted between envy and entitlement. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Family sticks together," he said, his tone dripping with arrogance. "You've got plenty of room. I deserve some of it." I almost laughed then, but I held it in, waiting to see if he was serious. He was. He talked about how unfair it was that I had all this while he was struggling. He twisted his words like I owed him a piece of what I'd worked for, as though blood alone gave him rights to what my hands had built. Not long after, Richard and Elaine chimed in, echoing his demand like a chorus. They tried to soften it, calling it help, framing it as my duty. "He needs stability," my mother said firmly. "You should help your brother." My father nodded, his voice heavy with authority, as if his word could still command me the way it once did. I looked at all three of them standing there in a line, acting like my years of sacrifice were theirs to claim. And then I couldn't help it. I laughed loud and unrestrained. Their faces stiffened, unprepared for the sound. I told them flatly that not a single inch of my land would ever belong to them. What I had built was mine alone, and they had no place in it. The air turned cold as the weight of my words sank in. Dylan's face twisted with rage, my mother's lips pressed into a thin line, and my father's shoulders slumped with something that looked like defeat. I didn't give them a chance to argue. My voice cut through the silence, steady and final. "You are no longer my family." The sentence hung there, heavier than anything I had ever said to them. They had disowned me years ago with their choices, but this time, it was my turn to sever the tie. I turned away, leaving them rooted in the dust of the driveway. For the first time in my life, I felt no need to look back. Time passed, and the distance I put between myself and them only gave me more room to grow. What began as a patched-up farmhouse turned into something larger than I ever imagined. I bought the land next to mine when it went up for sale, doubling the space. Fences went up, pastures opened, and soon goats and chickens filled the fields with noise and life. I turned a section of the property into cabins for visitors, And word spread quickly. People came for weekends, some for weeks at a time, paying to stay on the very land I had once been told would never amount to anything. The income gave me freedom I had never known before. While my life expanded, Dylan's narrowed. The stories filtering back to me told of creditors, repossessions, and angry phone calls. He borrowed more than he could ever repay, chasing the same illusions he'd always lived by. My parents, unwilling to admit they had chosen wrong, started selling their own belongings to keep him afloat. Family heirlooms, jewelry, even their savings, all slipped away trying to rescue him from holes he dug himself. The more they gave, the deeper he fell. Meanwhile, whispers about me traveled quietly through relatives at weddings, holidays, and funerals. They spoke of my thriving property, of guests who came back again and again, of animals well cared for and fields that looked alive. The same people who once dismissed me with pity now lowered their voices and said almost with awe how well I was doing. I didn't need to defend myself anymore. My life spoke for itself. One crisp morning, I sat on the wide porch I had built with my own hands, a steaming cup of coffee resting between my palms. The barn glowed red in the sunrise, animals stirred in the fields, and the cabins stood ready for their next visitors. I breathed in the peace I had carved out of nothing, the silence of freedom. And in that stillness I realized the truth. The best revenge had never been shouting at them or proving them wrong with words. It wasn't about payback or anger. It was about living a life they swore I'd never touch, and watching from a distance as the very people who called me a failure choked on the sight of my success. Do you think I made the right choice by walking away from them completely, or should I have tried to forgive? I'd really love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories like mine.